April 9, 1943. The North Atlantic was a graveyard. Cold, dark, and merciless, a place where steel beasts stalked beneath the waves and men lived and died by the sound of sonar pings. The German Kriegsmarine ruled these waters with its dreaded U-boat packs, hunting Allied convoys night and day. But on that morning, somewhere off the coast of Norway, a lone British submarine, HMS Seraph, found itself in the crosshairs of one of the most dangerous naval traps ever set. She had been shadowed for hours by a pair of German destroyers, armed with depth charges and orders to kill. Inside the submarine, the air was thick with sweat and oil. The men spoke in whispers, their ears tuned to every echo on the sonar. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Bill Jewell, stared at the depth gauge as it ticked lower and lower. 200 feet. 250, 300. The steel hull groaned like a wounded animal. The Germans were closing in. Sonar pings echoed through the hull, steady, methodical, merciless. Then came the first explosion. The boat shook violently, light bulbs burst, pipes split, and cold seawater began to trickle through the seams. Jewell knew that staying hidden much longer was suicide. The destroyers above weren't guessing, they knew exactly where the Seraph was. Then, through the deafening noise and chaos, an idea struck him, so insane, so reckless, that it could only come from a man with nothing left to lose. He looked at his first officer and whispered, "We're going to make them believe we're already dead." The crew stared in disbelief. But there was no time to argue. The Germans were preparing for another run. And so began one of the most daring submarine escapes of World War II, a deception so perfect that it would fool the entire German Navy. The Seraph's engines fell silent. The hum of machinery faded into an eerie stillness. In that moment, the submarine became a tomb, motionless, lifeless, drifting deep beneath the waves. Jewell ordered the ballast tanks to vent just enough air to make the boat sink even deeper, 350 feet, then 400. Any deeper and the hull might collapse under pressure. But that's what made it believable. If the Germans thought the submarine had gone beyond its crushed depth, they'd assume it was destroyed. Above them, the destroyers circled like sharks. The sea trembled as another row of depth charges hit the water. Boom! The shockwave ripped through the submarine, knocking men to the floor. The lights flickered out. One of the engineers screamed as a valve burst open, spraying scalding steam. Jewell didn't flinch. He waited, eyes locked on the sonar display. The Germans were listening, and he needed them to hear what they expected from a dying submarine. He ordered the crew to flood one of the aft compartments, slowly. The sound of rushing water would echo upward, a death rattle in the ocean. To make it more convincing, they released oil and debris through the torpedo tubes, scraps of metal, wood, and personal effects, anything that would float to the surface. Moments later, on the deck of the German destroyer, sailors cheered. Through their binoculars, they saw the telltale slick of oil rising to the waves. Broken debris followed, the unmistakable signature of a submarine kill. The captain of the destroyer logged it proudly, "British submarine destroyed. No survivors." But deep below, HMS Seraph was still alive. Silent. Waiting. The men whispered prayers in the dark, lungs aching from the thinning air. Hours passed. The Germans finally moved on, satisfied with their victory. When Jewell was sure the sea was clear, he gave a single order. "Engines, ahead slow." The Seraph stirred back to life, like a ghost returning from the dead. For the next 6 hours, the submarine crept silently through the depths, avoiding every sonar ping and patrol route. The North Atlantic was enemy territory, and one wrong move could bring the entire German fleet down upon them again. Inside, the temperature had dropped to near freezing. The men's breath fogged in the dim red light. They had run out of fresh air long ago, every breath felt heavier than the last. But Jewell's gamble had worked, at least for now. He knew that their escape wasn't just luck. It was timing, psychology, and sheer nerve. He had learned from the stories of other submariners, men who had tried similar tricks but failed because they surfaced too soon, or too late. As dawn broke, Seraph slowly rose toward periscope depth. The captain peered through the lens, nothing but endless gray sea. No smoke on the horizon. No enemy ships. They were alone. Then, just as he was about to order the submarine to surface, the sonar officer called out, voice shaking. "Contact, bearing 090, fast mover." Another destroyer. The Germans had sent a second patrol to confirm the kill. Jules' heart pounded. If they were caught now, it would all be for nothing. He ordered a hard dive, straight down to the ocean floor. But this time, they couldn't risk another fake death. They had to disappear completely. The Seraph descended into the murky darkness, deeper than it ever had before, deeper than the manual even allowed. The hull creaked like thunder, rivets groaning under pressure. 1 more meter, and it could all collapse. And then, silence. The pressure at that depth was crushing, like a mountain resting on top of the submarine. Every man aboard Seraph could feel it in his bones. Bolts groaned, metal pinged, and the hull flexed with each passing second. Jules stood silently, eyes locked on the depth gauge as the needle trembled just above the red zone. The chief engineer whispered, "Sir, if we go any deeper, she'll crack." Jules didn't answer. His face was pale but steady. He knew that if they surfaced now, the destroyer's sonar would pick them up instantly. The Germans were sweeping in a tight grid pattern, methodically searching for any sign of life. So they waited, motionless on the seabed, silent as the grave. No talking. No movement. Even the sound of a wrench hitting the deck could mean discovery. Minutes dragged into hours. The air grew stale, thick with carbon dioxide. The men's breathing became shallow, desperate. A few started hallucinating, whispering about seeing light through the hull or hearing voices outside the boat. But Jules held them together with the calm authority of a man who refused to die. Finally, after 4 agonizing hours, the sonar operator lifted his headphones, eyes wide. "They're gone, sir." Jules didn't believe it at first. He waited another 30 minutes, counting every heartbeat. Then, slowly, he gave the order. "Blow ballast. Let's go home." The hiss of compressed air filled the submarine as Seraph began her slow ascent. The hull moaned, the pressure eased, and a collective sigh filled the cabin. After more than 12 hours underwater, they were coming back from the dead. But what they didn't know was that their escape would become one of the most legendary acts of deception in naval history, a story that even German intelligence refused to believe was real. When Seraph finally surfaced under the cover of night, the men climbed the conning tower and breathed fresh air for the first time in nearly a day. The stars stretched endlessly above them, cold, brilliant, and silent witnesses to their survival. Jules scanned the horizon with his binoculars. Nothing. Not a single ship. The sea was calm, eerily calm, as though the ocean itself was giving them safe passage. They moved slowly, engines at minimum power, zigzagging to avoid detection. Their destination, the Scottish coast, hundreds of miles away. It would take days, but at least they were alive. Below deck, the crew sat in stunned silence. The enormity of what they'd done was just sinking in. They hadn't just escaped, they had fooled the German Navy into declaring them dead. The enemy's records would soon list HMS Seraph as destroyed in action. It was the perfect cover, one that would soon be used to their advantage in a way none of them could imagine. Because the British Admiralty had plans for Seraph, dangerous plans. Within months, that same submarine, believed destroyed by the Germans, would take part in one of the most audacious deception operations of the entire war. But that story, known later as Operation Mincemeat, would begin with the lie that Seraph had already mastered, how to die convincingly without actually dying. When Seraph reached home waters, her arrival was kept a closely guarded secret. Officially, she didn't exist anymore. But for the men aboard, that invisibility became their shield, and their greatest weapon. Jewel and his crew were debriefed under strict silence. Every detail of their escape was studied by intelligence officers who realized its potential. What Jewel had done in desperation, they would now turn into strategy. The fake debris, the oil slick, the illusion of death, all of it had been executed so flawlessly that the German Navy filed the incident as a confirmed kill. It was psychological warfare at its finest, born not from a briefing room, but from the instinct of a man trapped beneath the sea. Historians would later call Jewel's maneuver a masterpiece of submarine deception. But for the men who lived it, it was something else entirely, a miracle of survival, forged in fear, courage, and sheer human will. In the quiet after the war, those who served aboard Seraph rarely spoke of that day. Most of them carried the memory in silence, the sound of depth charges echoing in their ears, the darkness of the deep pressing against their eyes. Yet every time a sailor told the tale, one truth remained. On that April morning, in the cold, merciless Atlantic, a small British submarine fooled an empire. And against every law of physics and fate, she lived to tell the tale. The impossible escape had worked.